President Trump slammed Hamas, saying the group isn't interested in hostage talks, and bluntly added, "I think they want to die." Aid remains stuck while Gaza suffers, and some Western media blame Israel for the crisis, playing into Hamas's hands. What could Trump's statement mean for Israel's next move? Could this trigger the promised gates of hell? Tune in to today's episode of JLMinute for full coverage. Welcome back to JLMinute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Haston, correspondent for JNS News, along with Alex Trayman, CEO of JNS. We are in Jerusalem at the JNS Media Hub. Alex, let's get right to the top story. President Trump this past week declaring that Hamas isn't interested in reaching a hostage deal, signaled backing for Israel advancing its military operation. This happened a day after U.S. and Israel announced they were pulling their respective negotiating teams from Doha, where talks were taking place with Hamas on coming to some sort of agreement.
Yeah, let's look at what the president said.
Hamas didn't really want to make a deal. I think they want to die, and it's very, very bad.
Are you done?
And it got to be to a point where you're gonna have to finish the job. They really they asked the thing. Don't forget, we got a lot of hostages out, so now we're down to the final hostages. And they know what happens after you get the final hostages. And basically, because of that, they really didn't want to make a deal. I saw that.
So there you have President Trump saying that Hamas didn't really want to make a deal. Alex, didn't we know this all along?
I think we did know this all along, and this has been the problem in the strategy for Benjamin Netanyahu, really tying the success of the war to the goal of bringing back all the hostages. On the one hand, it's completely virtuous. On the other hand, you have Israelis that are really primarily concerned first and foremost with the return of the hostages. But then on the flip side of this, you have the fact that the war has dragged on and on and on and on because of the desire to bring the hostages home. And what we're seeing around the world is that the patience for an Israeli operation that we thought probably was going to last a few weeks, a few months, is coming in on close to 2 years. We're still fighting this war with after nearly 2 years of time, but fortunately, there's a president in the White House, Donald Trump, that understands that Hamas cannot rule Gaza on the day after this war. And now, once again, it seems like he's giving Israel the green light. Now, the president's given the prime minister the green light many times. The prime minister went to visit Donald Trump in February, just weeks after the inauguration. Netanyahu came home with the green light. And then you saw a renewed military offensive. We saw that Trump gave Israel weapons to defeat Hamas, and you see that they do a little bit more. But you also hear soldiers saying that the government and the top echelons in the military are not backing them to go and do this job and to finish it as fast as possible. The president noting in his comments that because there's only really 20 living hostages left, that Hamas can't give them up, because if they give them up, that's their cards, and their cards have been to hold these hostages as long as possible. So Trump realizing it. The question is Netanyahu going to realize it too? Is Israel going to do what needs to be done to finish this war as quickly as possible? And unfortunately, if that means that the hostages don't come back, I mean, that's a tragedy. That's an absolute tragedy. But how many soldiers have we lost just in the last month, Josh? I mean, we're probably dozens of soldiers only in the last month, and soldiers that are dying because the war is not being fought with full force the way the war needs to be conducted.
Unfortunately, another 2 soldiers pronounced killed by Hamas over the last 24 hours or so. So what needs to change in terms of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his overall attitude towards the war? He said time and time again, there are 3 goals: the return of the hostages, making sure Hamas is no longer the ruling party in Gaza, and making sure that Gaza is no longer a threat. So how do we get to all those steps at this juncture?
Well, Gaza is likely in the short term not a threat to Israel. Now, if Hamas stays in power, they will rebuild, and they will make Gaza into a threat for Israel once again. I mean, we know that. That's their charter. Okay, so you can't leave them standing. And what you can't do is leave them in power because you're doing everything you can to bring the hostages back. You've brought back 148 living hostages. Now, 250 hostages were taken on day one. We don't really even have an accurate number. I'm not sure if we know the number of those 250 that were actually living on the first day. Like, we have good information to know that Hamas took dead bodies, people that were killed on October 7th, and were holding them also supposedly as hostages to inflate the numbers. 148 living hostages have been returned, about 197, I believe, live hostages plus bodies have been returned out of the 250. It's really an incredible feat that they've been able to do that until now. But to understand that Hamas is going to double down on the remaining hostages, because you have to understand, and this is what people have told Netanyahu from the beginning, that defeating Hamas and getting the hostages back are two goals that don't necessarily go together, right? The only way you're going to get the hostages back at the end is in the final moment when Hamas is completely defeated. So as long as Hamas continues to run around Gaza and think that Israel doesn't have what it takes, and this is a question of willpower, not military might, to take them out, they're going to continue to hold the hostages.
And at the same time, Hamas is operating a well-oiled propaganda campaign claiming that Israel is starving the residents of Gaza. At the same time, and this is the focus of the world right now, by the way. Right now, Israel says, Kogat, the branch in charge of delivering the aid here in Israel, they released the video saying there are 950 trucks sitting at the border. The UN is saying that they are not going to deliver that aid. You have the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, the US-based fund, offering to take that aid and distribute it, as the international community essentially is in cahoots with Hamas, not delivering the aid, preventing people from getting that aid, and then turning around and blaming Israel, along with the overall campaign that Israel is starving, which the idea says absolutely not. Israel is not starving the people of Gaza.
Well, we've seen how this propaganda machine has taken hold since the beginning of the war. Remember, just 10 days into the war, Israel bombs the hospital in Gaza, kills 500 people, right? It didn't matter that Israel didn't hit the hospital. It was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. It didn't hit the hospital. It hit the parking lot. And because it was close to midnight when the Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket hit, that 500 people weren't killed. But this was the Hamas strategy on day one, okay? To create propaganda, to say that Israel is murdering civilians, that Israel is attacking hospitals. That's the reason why Hamas sets up their camp inside hospitals, so that Israel will attack hospitals. So you can say that Israel attacked hospitals, right? And then things move, right? And then it's, okay, great. Well, Israel's targeting civilians, and Israel's saying, well, we don't target civilians, and we've brought the kill rate of terrorists to civilians down to 1-to-1. It's the lowest in the history of warfare, and it will be studied as the new standard for how to deal in an urbanized, densely populated fighting environment. But then the propaganda shifts to, Israel is committing genocide, right? And people twisting what the word genocide means, even though the whole genocide convention was developed after 6 million Jews were slaughtered in a systematic genocide, which included concentration camps, gassing of Jews with chemical weapons, and then being incinerated in crematoria, right? 6 million Jews in the scope of just a few years. You had at certain points in Auschwitz, 10,000 Jews being murdered a day, okay? And people are saying here that maximum 50,000 Palestinians have been killed in almost 2 years of fighting, with at least 20 of them being terrorists. And we know that those numbers are inflated, okay? But then we try to prove that we're not committing a genocide. And then when Trump says, okay, well, what we need to do is to get refugees out of the Gaza Strip, so then the world says, well, now you're committing ethnic cleansing, right? And so meanwhile, not one Gazan has left the Gaza Strip because nobody's taking them. And now what's happening is that the whole world is saying that Israel is starving the Gazans, okay? And meanwhile, Israel's trying to combat that propaganda by saying, no, we've brought in 950 million, however many tons and trucks and whatever it is. And look, there's trucks that are sitting here and the UN's not distributing them and Hamas is getting, and we have all these explanations. What we have to do is to say, that this is Russian-style propaganda, and that you that are repeating this are falling for the Russian-style propaganda. That's two. And then the next one is that you are actually doing Hamas's bidding for it because this was their strategy. Their strategy was that you in the West were going to accuse Israel of attacking hospitals, killing civilians, genocide, ethnic cleansing, starvation, whatever it is, and that was the Hamas strategy. That's how Hamas defeats Israel, and people are falling for that, and they're willing to fall for that. And I think that the chief of this strategy is Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah, we'll talk about him in just a few minutes. But again, if you watch the mainstream media right now, I mean, it's like October 7th never happened with starvation, genocide, ethnic cleansing, all these terms they're throwing out. It's almost as if, you know, especially genocide, that this was like a premeditated attack on civilians in Gaza. And it's like October 7th never happened.
You see that these people around the world are stating that Israel, like, specifically allowed October 7th to happen in order that then we should be able to go in and commit a genocide and an ethnic cleansing and starving the population. Meanwhile, you know, we're seeing that these babies, you know, that they're showing sick babies, okay, babies that are like really ill from hospitals, and you're exploiting them and taking them out and showing these are the pictures of the Gazan babies, or taking starving children from Yemen and showing pictures of Yemen kids, okay, and then you also see that in these videos, these propaganda videos, that the adults that are holding the children, you know, they're not starving, right?
And other kids in the photos not starving.
This is a Pallywood show, okay? Israel has put more food into the Gaza Strip. And you have here in Israel the argument, like most of the population is holding the government responsible, saying, why are you sending humanitarian aid, any of it, into Gaza when they're holding our hostages? Right? So here, like, Israelis don't even want humanitarian aid to go in, and the Israeli government saying, no, we're going to flood Gaza with humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, who's paying for that humanitarian aid? And why is Israel paying for that? Why isn't the international community paying for humanitarian aid? Why isn't the international community opening up their borders for the starving Gazans? Not France, not England, Kyle Starmer, that's saying that it's indefensible, the starvation. He's not saying, you know, we want to take hundreds of thousands of Gazans over here so that they can get a good meal, right? They don't care about the Gazans. They just want to say that Israel's starving the population. It's Israel's fault. Israel's the devil, right? That's their propaganda machine. That was their strategy from day one of the war, because they knew they would never defeat the IDF on the battlefield. And the entire Western world, for that matter, save President Trump, the only sane one, the only sane leader in the West, him and maybe Geert Wilders, and also maybe Viktor Orban, you know, but you'll have very few sane leaders in the West, you know, led by Donald Trump. That everybody else is just really, they're not only falling for the propaganda, they're being used by a terrorist organization to promote the propaganda, and they're proud of themselves. And quite frankly, I mean, if you're falling for this propaganda, it's only because you have a hatred for Israel.
Absolutely.
And it was latent. It was a latent hatred for Israel that was waiting for this military operation in order to be drawn out.
No moral clarity and a hate for the Jews and the hate for Israel.
They have clarity. All over they have clarity. It's just they're on the wrong side of history.
Even so, the IDF last night began another series of actions aimed at improving what we were just talking about, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, going back to dropping in parcels via these like parachutes, which open up and send in these packages.
Do you remember what happened before? I mean, Jordan, the United States, you know, under the Biden administration, started airdrops of aid. So first of all, like, what happens? The aid falls out of the sky, basically in parachutes. It hits the ground. A lot of it, like if a bag of flour, like explodes. Okay, you know. On a couple of occasions, I think pallets of aid literally like fell on people and killed them in Gaza, and it was stopped because it was an ineffective measure. The same way that floating port was an ineffective measure. Now, I also read that Israel's willing to let Egypt open up the Kerem Shalom crossing, like into Rafah, to let humanitarian aid in. But now we have to be careful, because, well, we know that weapons were smuggled in from Egypt into Gaza before the war. That was the reason why Hamas didn't want Israel to go into Rafah. That's why Kamala Harris said you can't go into Rafah. The Biden administration saying you can't go into Rafah. That's the reason why they said you can't take the Philadelphia corridor between Egypt and Gaza, because that would expose the smuggling routes. Okay, Rafah. They said they put a stop on Israel going into Rafah for several months, and by doing that, it allowed Hamas to booby trap the entirety of Rafah, because Israel was stuck in the north, and they saw that Israel was going building by building. So, they booby trapped all of Rafah, and that's why the fighting is intensive in Rafah. So they don't want you to do that. But now they're saying we'll open up the Egyptian border again to let more humanitarian aid in. Meanwhile, what that border should be used for is to allow Gazans out. And not one refugee is being allowed to leave Gaza because, quite frankly, the Western world, those that hate Israel, they don't care about the Gazan people. They don't want them to escape. They don't want them to be out of this war-torn strip that's going to take a decade or more to rebuild. They just want them to stay there, and they want the whole humanitarian disaster that they started and they continue to perpetuate to be on Israel's head.
And as all this is going on, you have a direct reward to Hamas for carrying out the October 7th massacre. You mentioned it before. You're talking about the president of France, Macron, saying that his country will recognize the state of Palestine, whatever that means, wherever that is, and we can talk about it. But he plans to go to the UNGA this September and recognize Palestine. Where is Palestine? Who's the leader of Palestine? What does it look like? What does it consist of? Doesn't seem like it really matters to him. This is a direct reward to Hamas for carrying out the October 7th massacre. Prime Minister Netanyahu strongly condemning Macron's decision to recognize a so-called Palestinian state next to Tel Aviv in the wake of the October 7th massacre. Every single minister basically came out over the weekend and just blasted Macron for taking this action, which I said already, I think twice, is a direct reward for murdering 1,200 Jews.
Well, first things first, there's not going to be a Palestinian state. Israel is not going to facilitate a Palestinian state. Israel is not going to withdraw from any territory, okay? The land for peace formula has been proven a disaster. Israel completely withdrew from the Gaza Strip to create a provisional Palestinian state. Gaza was the pilot project for the Palestinian state. October 7th and the 2-year war that's followed it is the direct result of Israel ceding land for peace, okay, and giving control to the Palestinians. Remember, they gave Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, okay? Palestinian Authority lost control of the Gaza Strip. Within just over a year of taking over the Strip, Hamas took over and then won an election. The people actually voted for Hamas. The reason why Mahmoud Abbas doesn't have an election in the Palestinian Authority since his first election in 2005, and right now he's in year 20 of his 4-year term, is because he knows that the chances are that Hamas would win an election in Judea and Samaria. Okay, so Macron recognizing Palestinian state is just basically saying we don't believe that Israel has rights to that land. Okay, the Palestinians attacked Israel, okay, in a war for the land, and now the international community cannot deal with it when the Palestinians lose the war, right? So you're just basically validating the strategy of terrorism. The idea that we used to say we don't negotiate with terrorists. Now we're saying, oh, you committed an act of terrorism against Israel because you think that Israel is some kind of occupying force? Well, commit the biggest act of terrorism you can possibly come up with, okay? Make Israel go to war against you because you committed that huge act of terrorism. And don't worry, because we'll back you in the war. And then in the end, we're going to give you what you wanted from the beginning, okay, which is the Palestinian state. And what do they want to use that Palestinian state for? They're just going to use it as another launching pad to attack the remainder of the state of Israel after the Palestinian state. But Emmanuel Macron, your country is going to be cursed. You will be cursed as a leader because you are really on the wrong side of history over here. And Israel is not going to create a Palestinian state. It doesn't matter how many countries around the world recognize a Palestinian state. It doesn't matter what UN General Assembly or Security Council resolutions are passed. Israel is not going to create a Palestinian state. Israelis are not stupid anymore. You know, we've been mugged too many times by reality. And, you know, Macron, I don't know what to say anymore. It's not going to happen.
Every inch of land which Israel has turned over or withdrawn from has become a launching pad for terror. We know that. And here's some positive news to rectify that situation. The Israeli Knesset this week passed a resolution with a majority of 71 members. It's non-binding, but I think it's a step in the right direction in favor of applying Israeli sovereignty on Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley. Again, directly, I guess, in response to October 7th, in response to the disastrous Oslo Accords, the pullout from Gaza, which led to October 7th, the situation we're in today. So this is a first step in the right direction. Hopefully there'll be many more steps down the road.
Well, we have to see if Israel's willing to act on this, right? And I don't have any indications that the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is ready to act on this, even though, who's these 71 out of 120 members? The 71 members are the members of his coalition.
Right.
Okay, this is his government, plus even members of the opposition, several, are stating that Israel should apply its sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. Now, everybody calls this the West Bank, right? Yeah, but we know in Israel that these are the biblical provinces of Judea and Samaria. Jews are Jews because they're from Judea. It's not that hard to figure out. Now, I saw some kind of a funny meme on social media, which I think kind of explains how desperate the narrative situation is. They said, well, if it's called the West Bank, then it must belong to Jews because it's called a bank, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, but
Right.
but actually, it belongs to Jews because it's called Judea. And the elected members of the government, they want Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. They don't want there to be a Palestinian state. And so the question is, what is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to do when you have France stating that the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is going to be a Palestinian state? Are you going to leave the status quo intact, or are you going to flip the script and say no? And close this process of Oslo, which was the pathway toward that two-state solution, which has been a total failure, has led to two intifadas, and led to the pullout from Gush Katif, which was the Jewish communities in Gaza, 8,500 civilians taken out of Gaza. In fact, the anniversary for that, the 20-year anniversary is like this week. Yes, this is the 20-year anniversary this week of that disaster. Now, will Netanyahu do it? I think that the president of the United States is proving himself to have Israel's back, and that if Israel wanted to go apply sovereignty, there's not a better time and there's not a better president in the White House to support such a move than Donald Trump. And I think that Netanyahu's got to meet the propaganda with the truth. And the truth is that Judea and Samaria belongs to the Jewish people. At the same time, there's this beautiful, beautiful consulate right near the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Okay. That's a consulate of France that deals directly with the Palestinians. Okay. So if the Palestinians want to have, if the French want to have a consulate that deals with the Palestinians, they should open up that consulate where? In Ramallah. Okay, but meanwhile, they operate out of Jerusalem in a beautiful building right next to the King David Hotel in the old city of Jerusalem, in the western portion, the old Jewish portion of Jerusalem. And Israel should say, no, you're dealing with the Palestinians. Go. Why don't you tell your French diplomats not to live in Jewish Jerusalem, but to go live in Ramallah because you want there to be a Palestinian state and you want to deal with that.
Shut it down. Shut down the building. Why should we allow that building to operate in our capital when they're pulling off shtick like this?
Let's see if the Prime Minister of Israel will take action. I think that what we're seeing right now, and the narrative war, the global sentiments towards Israel are just turning more and more sour by the day, and we'll talk about that too a little bit later. But you have to stop justifying yourself on legal grounds. They have a narrative. Every time you just feed their narrative by defending that yourself against that narrative, and it's time to really flip the script. Okay, and this is on everything. We're pumping. I'm going off script here. We're pumping millions of dollars now in the Jewish people, hundreds of millions of dollars into combating anti-Semitism. And then you have other people saying, no, we're combating Jew hatred. So what we're doing is we're pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into the idea that people don't like Jews, or that they hate Jews, or that they're anti-Semites. and that it's becoming more and more popular to become anti-Semites. We're just pumping money into that. Instead, we've got to figure out how to pump the fact that we are winners, that we are proud, that we don't care what the international community says about it. We don't care if people are trying to attack us. We will defeat them, okay? Because we are going to win. You want the Palestinian Authority-controlled territories in Judea and Samaria to be a Palestinian state? No, they're terrorists. They fund terror, and they're fighting us for the land, and they're going to lose that war. We are going to apply our sovereignty in the land. You know, you have here, we saw just in Gaza, you had the minister, for example, Amichai Eliyahu. And I don't know if we can bring up what Eliyahu said, but then after, you saw the prime minister of Israel in a statement. You had the ambassador to the United States saying in a statement that this is not the policy of the government of Israel. This doesn't represent the war cabinet and the security establishment. The idea that Gaza should leave Gaza after October 7th, what they did, and the fact that they continue to hide Hamas among their ranks, the fact that they haven't pushed Hamas out and said, you know, they're over there, you know, leave us alone, we're peaceful. The Hamas terrorists are here, just kill them and then leave us be. They haven't said any of that. They're not protesting against Hamas. They're not expunging Hamas. They continue to hide Hamas. They are complicit. They're complicit. And they're going to lose the war for Gaza. And Israel should take over Gaza because Israel's the only entity that can maintain security and protect the Jewish people. It's only Israel. Nobody else is going to do that. Whoever, Qatar, the Emirates, the Saudis, you cannot trust them to not allow Hamas to rebuild in that territory. Okay, so here you're seeing that 71 out of 120 members of the Knesset said that Israel should apply its sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. Maybe people should listen to what the Israelis want.
The answer to fighting anti-Semitism, in terms of what you showed, what you talked about before, is Jewish strength. That is the answer. You can, you know, save your hundreds of millions of dollars and invest in Jewish strength and security, and you know, instead of all these campaigns which lead to nowhere. Let's get to a local issue here, but a very, very important here in the state of Israel, which affects policy. Yuli Edelstein, member of Knesset Edelstein of the Likud party, removed from head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And this has to do with the whole issue of the ultra-Orthodox and drafting them into the IDF. From what I understand, the Likud members, in order to maintain the coalition, decided they weren't happy with the way Edelstein was approaching this whole idea of equal service in the ultra-Orthodox, so they're pushing him aside. They're bringing in MK Boaz Bismuth to head the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in terms of reaching some sort of deal with the ultra-Orthodox, in terms of military conscription.
Right. You know, and this goes to show you that at the same time as Israel's fighting a military battle in Gaza and against all of Iran's terror proxies, and at the same time that you're fighting the eighth front and the whole diplomatic front, the public opinion front, there's also the domestic front. And you have the left wing has been pushing this issue, led by the court, to force Haredi conscription in order, not because they really want Haredim in the military. I mean, they do talk about the equality of balance of service. You know, why are Haredim not serving in the army? And I'll talk about that in a second. But these are focus-tested messages. It's meant to tear the society apart, and it's meant to force the Haredi parties to withdraw from the governments that Netanyahu's right-wing government will fall. People have to understand that's why this is being pushed to the front of the agenda. Meanwhile, until now, the army has done very little in order to try to integrate Haredim into the military. So they make it that they don't want to integrate, okay, for numerous reasons, because they make it that the Haredim don't want to come into this secularized army where they promote like women serving in combat and in other areas. So they make it complicated for Haredim to keep their religious lifestyle in the army in order that they can then have this propaganda, domestic propaganda message against the Haredim. Now, the Haredim do need to come into the army. And in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of really nice developments, specifically the Hashmonaim unit, which is an all-Haredi unit that's combat. And I've met several of the soldiers in the unit, and they're so dedicated and they're providing a tremendous model for this. And that follows also the Netzach Yehuda brigades, which are also like very religious brigades, even though maybe they're more like religious, like national religious, but they also provide like a great model. And I think that there is a desire, especially among the younger Haredim, the ones that are army age, to want to go into the military. But it's not going to happen like immediately. It's not going to happen without the preparations being made. It's not, it needs to become some kind of gradualized process. And Edelstein, even though he's a member of the coalition, he ran against Netanyahu as the head of the Likud party in the previous primaries. Okay. And when you do that, you're basically stating that you don't think that Netanyahu should be running the Likud anymore. Okay. And it's his right to do that, by the way. And I'm glad that he did it. And I'm glad that the voters of Likud decided the person that they wanted to lead that party. That's called democracy. That's okay. But what you can see from his action is that, he doesn't believe that Netanyahu should be the prime minister anymore. And he was sitting in a key position. And instead of finding the right compromise position in order to pass a new law that would bring Haredim into the army. And that's the way Israeli politics works. There's a give and a take. There's politics here. There's negotiations. Edelstein stalled the process. It led to many members of the religious members of the government actually withdrawing from the government. And only now has Netanyahu fired Edelstein. He probably should have fired Edelstein a long time ago. So this is a corrective move, but the question is, was it a day late and a dollar short? And will Boaz Bismuth, who really, I think even since the passing of his mother about a year ago, remember, he was actually dragged into a vote.
Right.
When his a no confidence vote, when he was sitting shiva for his mother.
Yes.
Okay. And since that time, I've seen him around, and he's wearing a kippah on his head in some cases. And I said, "Oh, why are you wearing that? You didn't used to wear it before." And so he's getting a little bit more traditional in his views. And I think that there's a chance that he will try to strike that balance, the one that's going to actually create the winning formula to bring the Haredim into the military and also stabilize the government. At least that's what he's going to try to do, and we'll see if he's successful.
At the same time, terrorism here in Israel on the local front. There was a terrorist attack on Thursday. 8 soldiers were injured in a car ramming attack near Netanya. Police launching a major manhunt, and from what I understand, they actually captured those responsible for that attack. I know on Friday there were several attacks in the Gush Etzion Har Hebron area. There was an attempted stabbing targeting soldiers. You had another terrorist who approached the community of Migdal Oz with a knife. His head was covered and he was throwing rocks. Both of those, in those cases, they were neutralized. Here, unfortunately, you had 8 soldiers hurt. I guess the good news is that they will all survive. 2 of them moderately injured, a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old. But from what I understand, the Israeli police and security forces successful in chasing down these terrorists responsible.
Yeah, so this is what terrorism looks like. You take your car, and your car becomes an instrument of death. You take your kitchen knife, and it becomes an instrument of death. They don't care. They'll just kill a couple people in order to draw Israel into a military response. That's how terrorism works. And they're professional terrorists, the Palestinians. They have been committed thousands and thousands of terrorist attacks, everything from these little car rammings and stabbings all the way up to October 7th. Now, this Kfar Yona terrorist, okay, there was a manhunt for him. And then where was he hiding? He was hiding in a construction site, and he was hiding in a crane.
Yeah.
Up a crane in a construction site in Pardes Chana. And through intelligence, they actually found the terrorist that did this, who was hiding like up in a crane at a building site. So the war on terror continues here in the state of Israel.
At the same time, you have international incidents involving Israelis. Unfortunately, we could probably spend an entire hour just talking about what has happened to Israelis traveling abroad. But let's bring up 2. You had a Israeli cruise which was trying to dock at a port in Greece, and then a mob actually of Arab demonstrators, protesters, hooligans surrounded the cruise ship and would not allow the Israelis to get off at their destination. So that's the first one, the first incident that we can discuss here. just some frightening scenes out of Greece. And then you had a second incident there. You had a flight, and it's just very, very strange, very odd. But in terms of what happened, the Spanish airline Vueling forcibly removing the director of a Jewish summer camp and 50 children from their plane, according to footage shared on social media on Wednesday. There was also an interesting development I saw in that case where Minister Shikli, responsible for anti-Semitism, said something that the pilot on that plane was like a known supporter of.
No, they reported that that the pilot of that plane was the pilot that trained the 9/11 terrorists.
I don't get, how is he still like a legitimate pilot? How is he not like? How is he still flying?
You know,
How's that possible?
I think that you know, the company that trained the 9/11 terrorists to fly planes. This was just like, you know, the 9/11 terrorists like went undercover and said, "Hey, we want to learn how to fly planes." They paid for a course, and it turned out that this was the pilot that trained them how to fly. There's no, we haven't seen any reported indications
to me, it's too much
as of yet.
Too much coincidence, you know.
Yeah, you know,
he didn't know these guys were training for
sure,
the
but clearly he was an anti-Semite.
Yeah,
but you know, back to the bigger picture here. You know, Israelis blocked from entering Greece.
Yeah.
Okay, Greece is an ally of Israel. Okay, like a close ally of Israel, and particularly there's a lot of you know, there's a lot of interest around natural gas in the East Med and trade and
tourism,
pipelines and tourism. Right, Greece is one of the primary tourism destinations for Israelis. I mean, there's more flights going back and forth between Greece and as a low-cost destination. There's tens of thousands, if not even like hundreds of thousands of Israelis like regularly in Greece. And the idea that now the Greek people are turning against Israel. And I've heard a lot of reports that the situation in Greece towards Israel, like among the people, is turning. And the same thing here in Spain, in France, in many of these countries, like in Spain and France, it's in part because there are a lot of Muslims in France, right? So Emmanuel Macron, who recognizes the Palestinian state, he's looking at his constituents and he's seeing that the Muslims are growing constituents in Paris and throughout the rest of France. And he goes ahead and he recognizes Palestinian statehood in order to maintain support with this new constituency that he has. And yeah, I think it's getting very dangerous for Jews to fly around Europe. We know that the International Criminal Court already put out the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and the former defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And the fear is that if those arrest warrants aren't repealed, that the next step from the International Criminal Court could be to put out arrest warrants against Israeli soldiers. And you consider that you had 300,000 Israeli soldiers called up during the war. Well, that's a very significant part of the Israeli population.
There were 2 soldiers, by the way, in Belgium, from what I understand, taken in for questioning, just because it was some people tracked them down, saw where they were traveling, and reported them to the authorities. And they were brought in by the police in Belgium.
So it's a very difficult situation right now. And you see here that, again, this comes back around to what we were talking about at the beginning of the war. The longer the war goes on, perhaps the worse that this situation is. And I think that, you know, you have to look at news cycles and the way these cycles have lasted. And, you know, first, COVID was the crisis for a very long time, right? And then we got past COVID and people almost have forgotten that COVID ever happened. And at some point, you know, everybody that was an expert on COVID became, you know, really obsessed about the Russia-Ukraine war. And that war is still raging, by the way, but many less people are as concerned about it because it kind of like passed the news cycle. Now, at a certain point, I imagine that this war between Israel and Gaza is going to end. And I really, really suggest strongly that the Prime Minister, the War Cabinet, figure out a way to end this war as quickly and conclusively as possible at this point, and hope that, you know, starvation, genocide, all these things come out of the news cycle, and then some kind of other world crisis comes in so that people's attention spans get diverted elsewhere. But meanwhile, you know, the situation for Israelis trying to fly abroad, you know, it's very, very difficult right now.
Difficult and scary. And switching gears here, I had never heard of these Nelk boys or their podcast. Apparently, you have these two. I don't know if they're comedians or social media personalities.
Yeah, they're like
here.
social media pranksters. And
But Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to go on their show, and they have millions of followers on YouTube and all the social media channels. He went on the show, I think he gave like an hour interview to these guys. And some people feel that this was the wrong move. Some people feel like Netanyahu, the interview backfired on him, trying, I guess, to appear to a younger, cool audience or whatnot, the next generation. But I mean, I didn't watch the whole interview. I just saw bits and pieces. But what do you think? Do you think this was the right move by Netanyahu, the wrong move? Was it a mistake to go on the Nelk Boys podcast? By the way, in order to show to be fair and balanced, the next day, they aired an interview that they did with a bunch of anti-Semites. They wanted to balance it out. So
right.
A lot to digest.
So first
there.
of all, the Nelk boys are not necessarily a worthy, worthy interviewers, especially considering what Netanyahu's goal is, which is getting his voice out to the people, and specifically trying to convince the people that have been turned away from Israel on the right of the American political spectrum. This is something that came on very fast. Just a year ago, we were talking about how, the right is the safe zone for Israel. The left has turned on Israel. And what we've seen in the last 6 months, I would say, is how quickly the American right has turned against Israel. And this is led by, Tucker Carlson, by Alex Jones, by Steve Bannon. And then you've got those that are sitting on the fence, right, that are showing some disappointing signs for Israel, including Joe Rogan, Charlie Kirk. Obviously, Candace Owens was maybe the first one, and she's jumped the shark.
Right.
It's like the pot is gone with her. Now, I know that Netanyahu was invited after Tucker Carlson interviewed the Iranian president, Pezeshkian. He gave a platform to the president of Iran after Israel attacked to spew his propaganda. And I know that Tucker Carlson invited Netanyahu for a podcast. In fact, Tucker Carlson said it right on his show a few times. He said, I have invited Netanyahu several times to come onto my program and we could have a talk. And this was taking place when the prime minister was at the Blair House. And I know that the prime minister's office was considering it, but at the same time, they said that they thought that after Tucker Carlson had interviewed Pezeshkian, that it would only be giving him legitimacy to go on the podcast, and that Tucker Carlson, looks really stupid right now, giving Pezeshkian the platform, and that you don't want to give Tucker any chance to rehabilitate himself by interviewing the prime minister. And instead, the prime minister decided to go on with these bumbling idiots, the Nelk boys. No offense. I mean, I thought they're okay. But considering what Netanyahu is trying to accomplish and how serious the issue was, going on with the Nelk boys is not exactly, the type of high level interview that the prime minister, should have been doing at that time. And I think that the prime minister probably should have taken Tucker Carlson head on. Now, I know that Tucker Carlson had Ted Cruz on, and it didn't go very well. And Ted Cruz, by the way, is very eloquent in general, and he's also an eloquent defender of Israel. But he didn't come off that well in the Tucker Carlson interview. But the prime minister is the best advocate that Israel has. And you've got to, in the middle of this war of narratives, you have to go into the belly of the beast. The same way that Israeli soldiers are going deep underground to fight inside tunnels, in the bowels of Gaza, the prime minister should go into the belly of the beast and sit down with Tucker Carlson. And who could debate Tucker Carlson better than the prime minister, right? And so they chose not to do it. Now, what's really interesting is, there's been 32,000 comments on the video on the YouTube channel. And I was scrolling them the other day when there was only 17,000 comments just to see what was going on. And it seemed to me like 16,900 out of the 17,000 comments at the time were negative comments. And that's very disturbing. It's a very, very disturbing reality. Now, one thing that did cross my mind, seeing that a lot of the comments look similar, They're similar in length, they're similar in style, things of stating like, oh, the Nelk boys gave Netanyahu the opportunity to come on. You're sitting next to a war criminal. You know, I'm unfollowing your channel because you did. There's some messages that just come up over and over again. And what you realize is that there's a very good chance that these are bot comments. Yeah. Okay. And so when you see that as bot comments, on the one hand, you know, you can maybe take a little bit of calm on that and recognize that it doesn't really represent the true sentiments of most of Americans or the people that would watch the Nelk Boys. On the other hand, the bot strategy is very effective, and people see it. And when people see all these bots commenting, so then you have these copycats, people that say, well, oh, this is what everybody's writing, I guess I should write too. I agree with what they're saying. And so then they make the same comments. And the ideas that the bots are pushing, you know, it's marketing 101. When you hear the same message over and over and over and over again, you start to believe it, even if you didn't believe it the day before. So it's very, very dangerous. And I think that if Israel and the Jewish people don't figure out a way to counterbalance, the bot traffic, the negative sentiments, and to figure out the best way of communicating Israel's real message. And like you said earlier, that's a message of strength, a message of victory, a message of pride. We're going to very quickly lose the American right. I think it's a very, very dangerous threat to Israel right now.
To be continued on that story. And we're nearly out of time, but just one other report here. An anti-government activist from Tel Aviv was arrested 2 weeks ago. It was revealed this week. She had planned to assassinate Prime Minister Netanyahu, according to Israeli police. A woman in her 70s was arrested after she spoke with close contacts in an anti-government protest movement about her assassination or potential assassination attempt. Her identity is under a court-issued gag order. So pretty scary stuff here when you have a 70-year-old woman. From what I understand, she was planning on using some sort of explosive device targeting Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Well, you see that she was coming from the anti-government protest movement. Now, by the way, the heart of the anti-government protest movement is people in their 70s, okay? You know, this is like a privileged class of Israelis that don't like the way the country is going, becoming more traditional, more right-wing, more religious, and they're protesting against this government because the government is the representation of the Israeli voters who put in a right-wing, religious, sentiment-friendly, settler-friendly government. Jewish communities living in Judea and Samaria, and they're against all of these things. Now, throughout the whole protest movement, and this goes back for 5 years plus already, and they talked about the prime minister, and in addition to that, they said that Netanyahu was dragging Israel into a civil war, that there was going to be blood in the streets, that this would eventually end with some kind of assassination attempt like it did in the 90s against Yitzhak Rabin. Like, these were the messages coming out of the anti-Netanyahu protest movement. So it's not a surprise, and this isn't even the first incident where somebody was caught up in this head of steam here of this protest movement, showing up week after week after week after week, thinking that they got to take matters into their own hands. Now, what's really interesting about it is that this woman was released to house arrest. Okay, and now you've got prime minister's advisors, by the way, who are being accused of being dual agents for Qatar because they were doing PR, who are like arrested at the airport, taken into custody, held in solitary confinement, okay, because they might have been doing public relations for the Qatari government, which is not an enemy state. And here you have a woman that had a credible plan to try to assassinate the prime minister of Israel. She gets released to house arrest. Okay, so it just goes to show you, what the state prosecution is finding important versus not finding important. But it's a dangerous situation, and there's a lot of domestic forces pulling at one another at the same time. On the one hand, you've got the anti-government protests, which, by the way, those are the same protests as the hostage forum protests.
Right.
It's led by the same people. It's not to say that the families of the hostages, don't have legitimate claims. They do. But the people that are running those protests, that are printing all the signs, calling for the return of all the hostages, are the same people that were running the anti-Netanyahu protests. You have to understand this. And then you've got on the other side those that are saying, you have to put Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. You have the issue of the Haredim going into the military. You have the taxes just going up and up and up to pay for the war. You've got a lot of forces. Israelis not able to go travel now, not able to go to Greece, maybe not able to go to Spain or France. Things are like spinning. They're spinning very quickly. And the only answer to all of this, by the way, is to win, to take care of the deep state in Israel. We know that Carolyn Glick, and one of the things that she's working on in government is specifically fighting against this deep state and correcting the wrongs, like ending the Oslo process, ending the Land for Peace formula, defeating all the terrorists, applying Israeli sovereignty, and just be winning and being proud of winning, and show to Jews around the world that the only place where you can really be safe and the only place where you're going to be protected and defended is in Israel, and is by the IDF.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, even with all this craziness, there's no place I'd rather be than here in Jerusalem, here in Israel. And on that note, we are out of time here on this week's Jerusalem Minute. Josh Haston here, correspondent for JNS, along with Alex Trayman, the CEO. Want to give a shout out to our production crew behind the scenes, Zach Sickerman, Yuri Svritsky, Ryan Lifshitz, Esther Eden. Make sure you go to YouTube and check out all the amazing content offered on JNS TV. And of course, go to jns.org for all the latest breaking news from Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next week on Jerusalem Minute.